Today I'm going to be showing you how to make this mid-century modern styled cabinet. I had never made a cabinet myself, so this was a pretty big learning experience for me. A lot of what you see in here might be unconventional, but hopefully you pick up some good tips and tricks along the way. This cabinet is primarily made out of plywood. It's going to be a 4x8 sheet, so I had my friend over at Home Depot cut it into 4 equal parts the long way. And for the cabinet doors, I used some solid oak boards. I brought out the miter saw and cut down the plywood into more manageable pieces. I cut my first piece to a length of 30 inches and I took it in light passes just to avoid tear out on the miter saw, since this is plywood. I then used the first piece to create a reference for the other 3 sides, and this way I could avoid measuring. I cut out each side, and of course it gave me an identical length. After that was all done, I set the table saw to about 10.5 inches because that's how deep I wanted my cabinet to be. I ran each panel through, and after that we had 4 identical panels. Now we can get the panels ready for assembly. I had never used this kit before, but it worked pretty great. This is the doweling jig by Milescraft. Since this cabinet will be going in my laundry room, I really wanted to use this jig to make sure that all my corners were straight and strong. And here's a quick glimpse of how it works. This piece that I'm holding allows you to drill perfectly centered holes onto the end of each board. Using the stop collar on the drill bit, you can set the drill bit to a little over half the length of the dowel, and this is going to make sure the dowel has space to go in on both ends. You can of course use as many dowel holes as you want for extra strength, but I only ended up using 5. Once you've made a hole for each of the dowels that you want to add, we can work on the alignment. To align the tool, just go ahead and stick a dowel in one of the holes. We can then use a slit on the opposite end of our tool to line up with the dowel. We then slide down the red collar and lock it in place. This is going to measure the depth of the board. Once that's done, you're ready to join 2 boards together. Set the board with the dowels on top and put the other board right below it with the perfect distance using the red collar. It's also a good idea to clamp the 2 boards together just so you don't get any movement. Now that you've measured everything perfectly, you can start drilling into the corresponding board. This takes a little while to get the hang of, but after you do your first corner, you'll find that the other 3 corners are a breeze. And I know I can't summarize everything that this tool can do in 30 seconds, so I'm also going to link a video in the description explaining exactly how it works from the company itself. Once I was done drilling the holes, I did a dry fit just to make sure everything fit perfectly, and after I made sure it did, I started to glue everything up, just for extra strength. The glue up in this case was very simple, but I tried to be as clean as possible because we're dealing with corners, which means there might be some spots that I can't reach after we're done. And since glue ups take a little while, feel free to like and subscribe in the meantime, if you like what you're seeing. In order to make sure the cabinet was strong and sturdy, I also ended up using some clamps just to hold the corners together while the glue dried. And now I can show you how to cover up that exposed plywood edge. I grabbed one of the oak boards that I mentioned earlier and I ran it through the table saw, making sure that I was only cutting off a strip that was about 1/4 of an inch thick. I ended up doing this 4 times just to make sure all the plywood edges were covered. I also made sure each strip cut was oversized, that way I could easily chop it down. Once each strip was cut down, I secured it with glue and brad nails. This cabinet is going to have a shelf right in the middle, so I measured the total height and then I marked it out on a scrap piece of plywood. After the scrap was cut, this gave me a very easy reference point as to where each shelf pin should go. I also used some table and miter saw tactics from earlier to make the shelf. Along with the shelf, I also had to make a back panel for the cabinet. So I cut out 3 equal parts that when put together would compose the back panel. On the first panel, I made 4 different holes for some dowels. I then clamped the joining board together and then used the red collar to reference the depth one more time. And with the depth perfectly adjusted, you can now approach it from the opposite side and align the tool with each dowel in order to create a perfectly aligned hole. Just like last time, I glued up the edges, put the dowels in, and then joined the boards. I don't have many clamps, but I do have these 2 heavy-duty ones that help in many cases. Once the glue on the back panel was done drying, I drilled pocket holes into each direction on the back panel. This is actually how you're going to be joining the back panel to the cabinet. And before you glue up the panels or attach them to the cabinet, make sure that the nice side is facing the inside of the cabinet, because that's what you're going to see every time you open it. On the other hand, you can use the ugly side on the back of the cabinet. Now, using some of those measurements from earlier, we can start working on the doors for the cabinet. And since this cabinet is pretty much a giant square, we're going to have 2 rectangular doors to make up that square. Just to go over the anatomy of a cabinet door very quickly, the long side is called the stile and the short side is called a rail. The stile should be the height of the cabinet, while the rails should be half the width of the cabinet. And that's why we're going to see 2 different sizes right here. And right now I'm honestly just cutting everything oversized just so we can work with these pieces when we carve out the designs on the router. This is what's going to give us the mid-century modern styling. No pun intended on those styles. I used a round nose router bit, and here's the trick on the router table. You really only need to map out the first line, because the moment that you turn it around and run the piece through the router again, it's going to draw an equal line on the opposite side. We had our 2 equal lines, but I wanted to give it a little bit more personality, so I also threw in a chamfer bit and ran each piece twice again. Now that I was a little more comfortable with the design, I cut each piece to size. And just like I do with everything else, I really only cut one out to the perfect size and then cut the rest of them out using that one as a reference. Right, so we have all our stiles and rails, but we can't forget about the center panel in the cabinet. I raised the table saw about 3/4 of an inch, and then I ran each interior stile and rail through the table saw so that the cabinet panel would fit in the middle. In order to actually get this to fit, I needed to give each piece 2 different passes. So I did the first pass, and then I scooted the guide fence over about 1/4 of an inch and did the second pass. This is going to open up the gap and make it a little easier for that center panel to fit. And because we're doing everything almost the exact same way, it should all have perfect alignment. Once that's all done, our layout should look something like this. I've been told you can join the corners with wood glue alone, but I wanted to make something a little stronger. Using the doweling jig, I drilled a perfectly centered hole into this wooden block and then marked the location of the hole using a line. You might have missed it earlier because everything was moving so quickly, but I drew a line through the 2 connecting pieces, so then we can use this line as a reference. And there are way fancier ways to do this joinery, but this is the best I could come up with. Surprisingly, it worked out pretty well. So here's the big idea. Our little wooden block here has a line and it has a perfectly centered hole running straight through it. And since each corner theoretically has a line drawn through it, when we line up our block with the corner, this creates a perfect spot for the dowels to join the corners together. And just like I suggested with the cabinet, it's also a good idea to test out the fitment on the stiles and rails before actually gluing everything together. And since everything fits surprisingly well, it was time to cut out our center panel. We know we want the center panel to fit between the stiles and rails, so you can use the line that you cut into those as a reference for the size that the panel should be. You should be using the deepest part of the inner groove as a reference. And if you're not comfortable with going off of these measurements, you can always leave the panel a little bit oversized and then slowly remove material until you get the perfect fit. I just overlaid my panels on top of each other and then cut them out all at once just to get it over with. And just like I did before, I did one more dry test just to make sure everything fit perfectly. And this is what it looked like. Also worth mentioning, the reason that I wanted to do mitered corners for the cabinet doors is because this allows the pattern that we routed out on the stiles and rails to flow perfectly. And just like everything else, once our test fit was complete, I started gluing everything up and then used some clamps to reinforce the joint. One of the biggest benefits of using dowels on the corners throughout this project is that the dowels allow for very little movement despite the clamps in place. And here's what I mean. If I would have used clamps and I would have had mitered corners without the dowels in place holding everything there, it's very possible that the tension on some of the clamps would have misaligned some of the corners. Also, be sure to keep an eye on the glue. It might start pouring out as you're clamping everything together. It's going to be a little easier to remove now, so that's what I did. And while I waited for the glue to dry, I went back to the cabinet and filled up the nail holes from the brad nailer using wood filler. And this was fast dry wood filler, so about half hour later I started sanding the cabinet itself. And many hours later, I came back to the doors and gave them the same treatment. I used an orbital sander with 240 grit sandpaper for most of this, and then I sanded some of the details by hand on the cabinet doors. When it came time to paint, I used Nuvo's cabinet paint in the Coconut Espresso shade. I ended up using a wide foam brush because I felt that this would give the least amount of streaks and give the most coverage. And sure enough, it did its job. This was my first time using this paint, but I could tell right off the bat this is some high quality paint. The paint felt very thick, but at the same time it was very easy to spread. I gave the paint a few hours to dry, and I came back in the middle of the night to install the handles. The lines that we routed out actually made it very easy to center each handle. And here's what's probably another unconventional tip, but when I want to mark out the location of the handle, I just push the handle into the wood and it usually leaves a little mark. I can then use the mark as a reference point as to where I should be drilling. After drilling out the holes, I grabbed the screws and attached the handles. Sure enough, it was a perfect fit. The only thing missing at this point is the hinges. What I like about these hinges is that they don't require any special tools for the installation, but what I dislike is that they don't seem to be adjustable like some of the other hinges on the market. These hinges did come with a piece of paper that served as a template for the installation, but I kind of lost that piece of paper, so I was just winging it. After I had attached the hinges to the inside of the cabinet, I laid the doors on top just to reference their position, and then I attached the doors to the hinges. I then secured all the extra screws, and that was it.